guys. Good to catch up with you again. It's been too long. I know that we are all super busy and juggling a lot of things besides these conversations, but it's super fun to get back to it. And I just wanted to start personally by saying, in the spirit of everything that we're doing, I am finding myself already heavily integrating into my own thinking and practices key things that I've taken from both of you. So I just wanted to share those really quick from our first conversations, really, and then it's just grown from there. But Andrew, your whole idea of relief continues to be something that I bring up across the board and credit you everywhere with clients and other professionals in my thinking and my writing. That's been a new cornerstone for me, and I just love it. So thank you. And for Kathy, the whole idea of the brain's job being to anticipate and predict, and thinking about how that dovetails in with all of the applied ethology perspectives that I have has just been so validating and empowering and furthering my own understanding of things. And I kind of wanted to start there because I feel like that's the point of everything we're doing, right? Is to say, hey, there's so many other really cool bodies of information and perspectives out there that are scientifically valid, that are beyond the kind of tip of the iceberg that we've all been taught to look at exclusively in the industry of dog training and behavior. So anyway, that's my intro with a big thanks to both of you.
Oh, that was very lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I feel the same. To just have, when we had that first chat, especially, there was something really validating about it, and just thinking, wow, okay, so some of these thoughts and some of these ideas, they're being shared by others. And actually, there are individual disciplines that look at those things specifically. So I've really been brought into the whole thought of ethology through you, Kim. And, you know, your book has just been a game changer for me. I love it. And it's one that I recommend to my clients now. And of course, with you, Kathy, we've known each other a little while now. But, you know, to have somebody who is actually thinking about neuroscience, but from a canine point of view, it supports all of us, right? That's at the point of everything, because that's the really geeky stuff to kind of show actually the dog will be processing something. You know, they don't hear with their ears, they hear with their brain, right? Because it's the brain that has to do this stuff. And
there is nothing that happens without the brain.
And that's really important for the whole exploring the emotional experience, which is my thing, really. Having your input, Kim, on the ethology side of things, and thinking about some of the genetic elements, and thinking about some of the kind of ways that dogs are likely to be looking at the world around them, and then for you, Kathy, to come and talk about how the neuroscience works about that, because whilst we all share that, you know, similar neurology, physiology, biology, it is that processing side of thing that makes it unique to us, gives us that unique emotional experience. I saw a webinar recently where somebody started off by playing different types of music, and it was a really cool way to start, because guess what, everybody's going to feel differently about some of these types of music, because that's their own experience of it, right? And some of it was pretty naff, in my opinion, but I'm sure other people really loved it. But yeah, so I think that's the thing I really got from this is just recognizing that some of these thoughts we might have, there's a whole discipline that supports those thoughts. You know, it isn't a kind of an end, like a cul-de-sac. There's like, oh wow, there's so much stuff out there for that.
Yeah, and for me, it's really an opportunity to go back to the roots of dog training and behavior. I feel like there's a lot of information out there that has already developed methods, that has already decided how those methods do work or don't work. And, you know, we all know the dog world's full of polarizing opinions, etc. But actually, if you boil it all down to thinking mechanistically about what's happening in terms of the dog's experience, it actually just makes a lot of those conversations disappear, because there is no need for that polarity. If you're just thinking about, okay, well, that method clearly works in some circumstances because some people are having success with it. So let's think about how it might be working and why it might be working in some circumstances and not in other circumstances. And there's a principle that we're taught when, as veterinary students, that I think is quite applicable. That, you know, the safest method is the method that you're most familiar with. And so you're taught right from the word go that it is unsafe to take on a better method without actually spending the time to really learn about it, understand it, and become proficient about it. So therefore, if you're giving clients two options, even though your method that you're offering as the preferred method may be less trendy, or, you know, maybe older, or may not be newfangled, it may very well be the safest and soundest because that's the method that you're the most proficient at. And I think sometimes we don't spend time thinking about that when we're thinking about different methods. Certainly this last week or 10 days, Bobby and I have got a bit of stick on Facebook. And we were both chatting about it, both saying that essentially everybody who wades in to give stick about opinions about methods is really coming from the idea that there's a good method or a bad method. And Bobby and I, when we're discussing things, are very often coming from, let's just think about what this method is doing and in which circumstances it may be applicable and in which circumstances it may not be applicable, and why that might be. So we get that deeper understanding, that kind of mechanistic understanding that I think supports people's choice. The assumption being that, you know, the vast majority of the people that we engage with on Facebook are actually kind people who want to work well with their dogs and want their dogs and clients to be happy, you know, leaving aside some of the practices that we may unite behind as being cruel or inappropriate.
Yeah, and Andrew, did you want to jump in there?
I was just very curious. So this is one thing about the whole the beyond the operant chats for me, because the how has been poured over so much, right? And that's where a lot of the conversations come. I think what we're doing is just asking more about the why, and also thinking about who is it, and just asking those questions of, okay, that's, so we're getting results, we're getting some of these outcomes. Maybe we need to start asking, why are we seeking those results, those outcomes? And most importantly, who is it that is actually setting the criteria for those results and expectations? And does it actually add any internal value to the dog? That's the big question for us, isn't it? Because a lot of the discussions around methods and tools is, well, look, it gets results, you know, because this is what we're doing. This is because it's very results driven. It's almost task driven. But is it a result for the dog? I think this is that's the kind of benchmark that we're trying to lay down. Let's just have these discussions, but keep coming back to the why. Yeah. Does it make any difference for the dog? I think that's the most important thing.
I think that's the nutshell of the shift to me, is why instead of how, right, is the starting point. Because I've been really reflecting a lot lately about what we were talking about last time, about pulling back further and further and getting a greater perspective. And aside from having the striking realization, as profoundly simple as this is, that dogs have been around for 15 to 40,000 years, living cooperatively and quite successfully. In some cases, people will make the assertion more successfully than any other kind of symbiotic partnership, you know, that's mutually beneficial throughout our evolutionary shared history. So it's been that long. And so 14 to 40,000 years, and then we have dog trainers for like 50 years. Like, you know, so that just struck me. It just struck me in a way it hadn't struck me before, even though I kind of knew it, right? Like, we know that, we all know that. But it was like, wow, like, we don't really need dog trainers to get along, right? So like, you don't need to understand how to use ABA and all this stuff in order to live successfully with another being. Lord knows they live successfully with each other. All social animals can live successfully with each other and communicate effectively and survive and adapt to conditions, all without our glorious help as the puppeteer. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about how it's so interesting how dog training has kind of, it's this very modern phenomenon, as well as the kind of captivity phenomenon. Not to say humans didn't keep dogs in captive situations historically, but I would say largely the scale was tipped in non-captive conditions for most dogs, with, you know, it tipping just in the last, like, our lifetime, right? Just in the last like 30, 40 years, to where most dogs in developed nations are kept in captive conditions. And I was thinking about how we're also kind of subconsciously indoctrinated into this pet culture and concept that this is normal, this is how you do it, these are the things you have to teach a dog, like almost all these assumptions about, well, they're too dumb to figure it out on their own, so you have to teach and train and program them, or else they'll just be a complete and total mess. And then I was thinking about the incredible weight of the responsibility and the power that we have, that we're wielding, the more we understand how to change behavior through really legitimate models like applied behavior analysis. We have so much power to manipulate their behavior against their own will in directions that may be completely maladaptive for the individual, right? For the dog's interests, but they might answer the demands or the interests of the person who's cohabitating with that dog. And I had the chance to speak with Grisha Stewart this last week, and it's the first time her and I had talked directly. And she made the most striking comment to me that I really want to credit her with and share, because this has never dawned on me before. Kathy, it made me think of you and your story with Raven and my own herding dogs that I've had, and all the kinds of high dopamine dogs, if you will, that we have in our population. She was saying that she remembers a seminar where she caught herself saying out loud that the reason that the training that she was doing when she was kind of in BAT 1.0, focusing more on specific behaviors and then using more food in that and trying to kind of operantly change the dog's behavior as opposed to kind of free shaping and pulling out what was organically working for them. She said, yeah, you just turn them into addicts, and that's why they'll keep doing the behavior that you want. And I was like, wow, I've never thought about it that way, but that's true, right? And so a lot of the neuroticism that we're like putting into our canine companions, genetically, like in the case that we were talking about last time, should there be ravens, you know, like that whole fundamental question. We've created dogs that have the part of their brain, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, you'll know this more specifically than I will, but is it the orbitofrontal cortex? Is that what it's called? The reward center?
Depends what's coming next.
What?
Depends what's coming next in the sentence.
That's the reward center of the brain, and that's regulating the brain's dopamine and reinforcement.
Just, I mean, potentially it's part of the reward circuitry.
Okay.
I mean, it's also potentially parcellated up differently in the dog. So some would argue that the dog doesn't have prefrontal cortex and parcellated orbital frontal cortex.
Okay, well, and that's
probably a discussion for another day.
Yeah, right. A whole nother rabbit hole.
Reward circuitry is a very safe term.
We'll say reward circuitry then, yeah, so that I don't get in over my head. And this is all where, by the way, we all tend to avoid talking about things because we don't have a degree in it. This is where we should be curious and brave enough to bring up concepts and then ask someone who knows more for more clarification. So that's just kind of something to throw out there. But I think it's really important to think we are genetically and then experientially creating behavior addicts. And that doesn't mean it's working for the dog on a fundamental level. It means it's working for us in terms of the behavior that we're changing, what we're reducing or what we're increasing. And that's a lot of power that we're wielding through our ability to operantly change behavior above the surface there. But that whole iceberg beneath the surface about everything else that's going into behavior is still there, even if we can't observe it. And that's what needs to be addressed as kind of what's ultimately, as opposed to proximately, going back to Tinbergen's model, instead of just looking at it as at proximate, like what can we see in this moment, looking at ultimately what works for that individual and what creates a balanced animal that can actually cope with their habitat and their conditions.
And it's interesting if we think about epigenetics, right? Because these dogs are going on to being bred from, and, you know, well, there's a whole conversation about breeding. But essentially what we're doing is we're creating an environment where the behaviors that work are the behaviors that are dependent on us. So keep an eye on me, keep your peripheral attention on me, make sure that you have some attentional focus on me, and, you know, however we move through life, that will work. The behaviors that don't work are problem solving for yourself and disappearing off and spending time on your own and doing your own thing, right? So, and then that change in that behavioral environment is then potentially impacting epigenetically and then being passed on to the next generation. Now, we haven't shown that in the dog with domesticated behaviors, so it's not that specific in terms of science. There's a whole range of epigenetic science, right from, well, I spoke about worms with Nick Benger as a really good example of a model where this epigenetic impact actually occurs within 1 or 2 generations.
I saw that study.
Yeah, it's cool, isn't it? I love worm studies because you get information so quickly. But so, you know, and right the way through to mammalian species as well. So we know that this does occur. We know that, you know, experience in utero and then during the development phase up to adolescence, but then even into adulthood, which is what we didn't used to realise, does have an epigenetic impact. And then we go on to breed from those dogs. So again, that change is feeding back into your area, Kim, which is, you know, what's the domestic dog becoming? Because our relationship with the domestic dog has very much changed in terms of, if you go back 50, 60 years, the behaviours that worked were crack on, get on with your own life, stay out of trouble, and, you know, kind of hang around and you'll get some food and you'll get some shelter, etc. Whereas now it's a very codependent relationship. And it's, I mean, it's a really interesting journey for me because, newsflash, you two know already, but I am getting a puppy. He's 2 weeks old. And of course, now I'm going through the whole preparation, which for me involves scheduling and spreadsheets and data collection and stuff. And I'm now having to really reflect on, okay, what do I want my puppy to learn? And do I want my puppy to learn taught behaviours, or do I want my puppy to learn what I would call life skills, which actually very much are self-driven, problem solving, those kind of behaviours that are not taught behaviours. And it's completely different. So the last puppy that I had was, well, the last puppy that I had from a breeder, as opposed to a puppy that came through rescue, that was 20 years ago, where very much my plan looked like it was full of taught behaviours. So, you know, I wanted the dog to sit, to down, to do, you know, the 3Ds, distance, duration, etc., all of that kind of stuff. Whereas now I've kind of seen what the impact of that is, because in the last 20 years, we really have had that shift to what's it like living with dogs with that codependency, and, you know, what are the potential fallouts from that. So actually now I've just bought him a bib that says, please ignore me because I'm being taught to ignore you. That's the most important thing. And then we're just going to go and experience life. And there's actually going to be very much less taught behaviour, and there will be some because he's a sports dog, so, you know, there will definitely be some space for some taught behaviour, but it's not going to be, you know, the plan for him as he's growing up. So it is, yeah, it's really interesting to kind of live through that experience of, oh yeah, my approach to relationship with dogs is very different. Like for me, it's going to be really important that he learns to chill out, he learns to entertain himself, you know, he trial and errors on his own without me telling him what worked, what didn't work, so that he can decide what worked, what didn't work, etc.
And there's a lot of psychology behind this, I think, because, you know, and I think anybody who's watched this series so far, and especially if they're thinking about getting a new dog now, I'm hoping that they might have those kind of that thought process that you've been through, Kathy, thinking about things a bit differently. Because if we think about the difference between structured learning and experimental learning, the kind of you know, I discussed this a little bit at the behavioural conference. You know, when we think back to our own education as kids, there is a huge amount of structured learning that goes on with education at school. Most of that is pre-described and quite arbitrary, based upon the needs of society, right, or the expectations of society, or the needs of the school, or the expectations regarding grades, all these kind of things, which are important. But also a lot of that stuff probably isn't going to be innately useful to the child, and actually can end up boxing in that child within a construct that they actually find it hard to develop some of the experimental learning and actually put value to it. And we've kind of done the same with dogs, especially in recent years, where we put a heavy element on when that puppy first comes along. We've got to do loads of structured learning. They've got to do sit down, come stay. They've got to do all these kind of things that we feel are important from a human perspective. But as you alluded to there, Kathy, might actually be stopping the dog or the puppy from going through some of that really important experimental learning about learning some of the things that is going to have innate value, and actually creating some of the behaviors that we then feel we have to start training out of the dog. Because actually, if we'd have perhaps given them more time or not gone in heavy with that more structured training in the first place, they might not have come to have some of those behaviors, things like jumping up, things like anyway, but yeah, like I say, the kind of
we're paying a lot of attention to other dogs is a classic, right? And I intend my socialization for my puppy to be, there's nothing exciting about other people's dogs. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to prevent him from being able to interact, but it's definitely not going to be what we're going outside to do. We're going outside to just be and, you know, do other things, but other people's dogs and other people are not exciting, because actually that's going to be one of the best life skills for him, is that that's not the reason we're going outside. We're going outside for us, for him, for whatever it is that, you know, he wants to be able to do. He doesn't have to rely on looking for fun elsewhere. And I think sometimes people do end up with dogs that are so focused on, I must get to other dogs, I must get to other people, instead of, oh, this is a really interesting patch of grass, I can spend ages sniffing here.
I do wonder whether some of that has come about because of that structured learning. I know myself with my puppy clients, I don't do puppy classes, I do puppy one-to-ones. So when I first meet that puppy, I spend a lot of time learning about how that puppy processes, how it engages with the environment, how it orientates, a lot of the stuff that's quite innate and natural for that pup. And then we build on these things. What I was going to say before I had my brain freeze, jumping up, pulling on the lead, a lot of these kind of things come about, and that kind of over connection to things in the environment, I think, comes down to a lot of overuse of operant training at an early age that's kind of sticking that dog into a bit of a box that then it struggles to kind of process within that box.
Yeah.
And actually a lot of pups, you know, when you start giving them a chance to process, giving them time, giving them space, they make some amazing choices, even at a very young age. Yeah. And if we're going to support anything, let's support those choices rather than just having this arbitrary thing of, you must keep walking, you must walk at a pace that I decide, you must not look at this, or you must look at that, or you must listen to this, or you mustn't listen to that. It's just a lot, isn't it?
And also rewarding those behaviours that the puppy has worked out for itself. So, you know, if there's a meeting of dogs in the park and the puppy actually works out how to come away from that meeting with the dogs in the park, you know, just kind of, okay, I've had enough, I'm wandering off, then reinforcing that behaviour without actually being part of determining what that problem solving was about. And I think that, I mean, as a neuroscientist, that's the bit that seems completely and utterly crucial to me. We've got the puppy at the peak of synaptic plasticity. So in terms of creating connections and creating not only new neurons, but the neurons becoming more complex and more branched, etc. And also the maximum pruning. So those neurons that aren't being used so much, or behaviors that aren't working within the environment, all of those neurons being pruned back. So that's happening right at that point where we're supposed to be teaching our puppies X, Y, and Z. And actually that doesn't make sense from a neuroscience point of view, because really what we want that part of the brain development to be is the puppy discovering what works and what doesn't work for itself. We don't want food as a reinforcer. We actually want the reward to come internally. So we want the puppy to learn to be in tune with its own reward system, learn what works, what doesn't work, learn what makes it feel safe, what doesn't make it feel safe. Don't learn what mum or dad wants, because half the time mum or dad don't really understand the body language of the other dogs and what's going on anyway, because there are so many subtleties and, you know, smells that we can't smell, and so much going on in that interaction that we're, you know, not necessarily aware of. So yeah, from a neuroscience perspective, it's just going to be, yeah, I'm so excited, so excited.
So
it's an opportunity I haven't had before, because I've never had this much experience and had a puppy right from the start that didn't come from a traumatic background. Yeah.
I love hearing you talk about that, and it's really it's interesting, because about maybe 10 years ago, I was the first time that I learned about what trainers formerly call like free shaping, where you're like just catching what's arriving, you know, organically for the dog, as opposed to like manufacturing or luring or the behavior, you know. And it was amazing to me, the difference. And when I was just like, I think of it as feedback instead of like facilitation. I'm not deciding what's best for you. I'm just giving you feedback, and it feels really organic. It feels like, from that ethology perspective, it dovetails into kind of the natural social family model of how all species would exist in the wild, where they're giving each other feedback socially about their choices and responses to things. And also that individual is experiencing, as you say, natural internal feedback about, oh, to Andrew, again, to go back to the concept of relief, I felt a little, you know, maybe stress and maybe a little bit of anticipatory anxiety about this situation that was arising in this context. and then I did this, and then I felt relief. Okay, wow, that's a really important precedent for me. And that's what I'm really recognizing the more we get into this, and we're all kind of collaborating to give each other permission to get more into it. I'm recognizing the level to which we've handicapped our dogs. And Andrew, what you were talking about with the educational model made me think about something I heard, I think it was maybe like 5 or 10 years ago, about someone was talking about the American school system and the education model that we have here, which is actually also built on behaviorism. And it's all about repetition and conditioning and practice to have the right answer that we say is the right answer. And it's rigid, it's prescriptive, and it's not embracing or facilitating of creative individual thinking and problem solving. And what happened is that they started to see that, oh, China's outdoing us on the inventing of things, because American children are no longer learning to kind of think for themselves and value that, you know, creative problem solving, because that's not what we want. We want them to get the right answer, not think for themselves. So it also, then you could go into some big conversation about how interesting it is about where the American adult population is right now, and what the kind of like millennial, you know, phenomenon that we all talk about, like what all facilitated that, because that's the generation they were speaking of. And so I think we all got here kind of accidentally, right? Like, at least in America, I can say we adopted that behaviorism model, not just for dogs, but for our kids. So we were kind of well-intentioned going about putting the same kind of educational model in place for dogs we did for kids. You basically have to program them so that they will be good adults and do the things we want them to do in society. But it is so different from what creates a functional, resilient, adaptive individual with life skills, as you say, as opposed to obedience commands with 100% reliability to my programmed wishes, where the animal may have either become an addict or a robot out of fear, depending on kind of what techniques or combination of techniques we're using, where it doesn't work for them at all. It may work for us because we're keeping it in a box that makes it functional for us. But I think between those ways that we've navigated kind of their education, and then also what we've done to their genetics, as you described with through epigenetics. I mean, every population, like, I mean, every generation in the population, I feel like is worse than the one before. I mean, having done this for 20 years, I feel like dogs are not the same as they were 20 years ago. I feel like they're so much more dysfunctional, and they're kind of, you know, at younger and younger ages expressing incredibly maladaptive behavior responses. And what do? We train more, going back to what we talked about last time.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think an important word for us to think about is the word alignment in these contexts, because there'll be those people say, yeah, but you need to do all these kind of things for the dog. The dog has to learn, there are societal expectations on dogs, and the same kind of arguments we have with children. I saw a great podcast recently, I can't remember who it was, and if it comes to me, I will mention it, because I must remember to credit the lady. I can't remember her name, but she's an educational psychologist with working with children, and she was giving an example of how often you know, kids are kind of said, oh yeah, well, you know, life doesn't owe you a living, and you know, you've got to learn that life's hard, you've got to learn this, you've got to learn all these kind of things. And this person said, but hang on, shouldn't it be the other way around? Shouldn't society have learned maybe we need to change these things so that the next generation of kids don't have to go through that stuff?
Yeah.
And this is the thing about alignment. For me, it's a case of recognizing the things that we can do through operant training and the kind of expectations and the judgments that are there, but trying to find some alignment with the dog's emotional need and outcome. It's just finding that alignment. It isn't a case of shifting everything over to that side or shifting everything over to that side. It's just trying to find some alignment. And there has to be that middle way. There has to be. And that's what we're exploring through this series, of course. It's not a case of, I know some of the criticisms we've experienced is that somehow we're anti-operant. I don't even know how you can be that, but we're anti-operant, or we're anti ABA, or anti any kind of individual disciplines. Actually, the conversations have been, I think, way more nuanced than that. It's a case of just thinking about, okay, we've got the how down, like we talked earlier. The why is about seeking that alignment with the dog's emotional needs and outcomes, and looking at those things that intrinsically have internal value for the dog. Mm-hmm. Because the big thing we've got the big perceived wisdom that we've really got to kind of put a spotlight on is a lot of what we have been doing with dog behavior is just because we can. you know,
Yeah.
because that's just the fact of it, you know, whether it has any internal value to the dog or not, it's just because we do it, right? So I think that word alignment's an important one, and we always need to try and find that balance, because there is a huge amount of pressure on people, on the carers. There's a lot of societal expectations on dog ownership, and that's just not going to go away. But we've got to explore that middle ground more.
And also, you know, there is a big difference between starting from scratch with, you know, essentially a blank sheet in terms of trauma. You know, I'm the puppy that I'm getting is coming from an excellent breeder. It comes from excellent lines. They're very emotionally stable. The genetics are good. The experience that it's going to get before it comes to me is really good, you know, but that is unusual. I mean, that's the bottom line. It is unusual. The vast majority of people are getting puppies that by hook or by crook come from puppy farms, whether they come from puppy farms transparently or they come from puppy farms non-transparently. A lot of them come from what is essentially a puppy farm. And they're not bred to be emotionally resilient, and they're not bred and generations kept so that the breeding can be chosen, you know, appropriately to improve the lines, etc. They're just chucking out puppies for the sake of it. So there are different situations and different approaches. And if you get a puppy and at 8 weeks old, it's already got some behavioral issues, i.e., you know, a lack of resilience or inability to be left on its own, or, you know, whatever it is that's developing as you're working with the puppy, you're going to have to use some different methods. You know, just sitting and waiting for the puppy to puppy solve on its own may not be enough. But understanding that kind of jigsaw puzzle makes sure that, like, you know, you were saying, Kim, when you're using those really powerful tools, you're using them thoughtfully and you're using them carefully, and you're not overusing them, and you're ultimately using them so that you can support the puppy or the dog in being able to learn to problem solve itself, or learn to have a little bit of autonomy, or learn to recognize its own internal signals for what is or isn't relief. And the reason I was scrolling through Facebook while you were talking, Andrew, it's not because I was ignoring you. It's because I was looking for Kayla's name. So if you look at trainers like Kayla Delahaye or Jane Arden is another one that I mentioned quite frequently. I love watching their posts because they both use a mixture of different methods, and they're not fixed on a particular method. In the case of Kayla, she's not only doing one dog sport, she's doing a whole variety of dog sports, and she's also not only doing dog sports, but she's also, you know, doing a lot of hiking and a lot of, you know, just being with her dogs and stuff. And it's just so wonderful to see that richness and complexity of what it means to be a dog in those households. And I think that for me feels like the alignment. You know, you can align these different methods. You can align dog sports with non-dog sport activities. You know, you don't have to have one or the other. One doesn't have to be right and one doesn't have to be wrong. But by creating the right complexity of jigsaw puzzle that just fits perfectly for that particular individual, by having that time to observe, you know, what's working, what's not working for the individual dog, then I think we are really providing for the needs. We don't have to go one way or the other. And I think often when we do go one way or the other, that's where things go wrong, because we become too polarized and we end up in echo chambers.
Yeah, and I think I love how all of our conversations seem to do this, like coming back to full circle and coming back to previous points and stuff. But you're talking about alignment makes me think about like the whole analogy of the lock and the key that I use a lot, you know, using a ethology model, talking about dog behavior from the perspective of, you know, all other species, and kind of like you're coming into the world already armed with that kind of knowledge, that genetic knowledge, if you're in nature, of like what worked and what the signals mean in your environment so that you can operate appropriately, where you have that alignment, right? The jigsaw pieces fit, the key fits the lock. And going back to your barometer kind of analogy and the discussion of behavior being the evidence, if you will, of welfare or compromised welfare, when you get the friction in the fit and the puzzle pieces don't fit, or the key doesn't fit the lock, you get that grinding. That's when we should step back and say, my job is to help, not fix, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if my job is to help, and that's a whole value shift in the world of dog training, then like what Simon Gadbois was bringing up was, he was saying that like we always focus on changing the animal first instead of changing the environment. And I don't just mean the immediate antecedents. I mean, you know, the more global antecedents that are going on for that animal in their reality, and all of the conditions that are creating the friction when you put that key in the lock in that particular kind of immediate set of circumstances. You know, what are the other things that we could do that could just completely change the math of the whole environmental recipe for the dog by moving all those other pieces around, so that the resolution is less about picking up that operant tool to manipulate their behavior and more about, oh, you're having trouble with this? Oh, how can I create relief? How can I take the pressure off for you? And recreate this situation in a way that is recognizing and compassionate about what's going on for you, and then is hopefully then through this experience not only making this experience go better, but also then starting to facilitate more resilience, better life skill, you know, better management for your own stress and arousal and frustration and all of that. And like that's a whole paradigm shift.
Yeah, and we've said it many. Oh, sorry, Andrew.
No, good. Go on, Kathy.
I was just going to say, we've said it very many times before, but often when you do look at the whole picture, so you look at diet, you look at interactions within the home, if you've got a multi-dog household, you look at, you know, all of those other factors, often the behavior doesn't need changing because it just evaporates.
Right. And that happens so much when you start shifting the perspective of practice, is that you're like, oh, I don't even need to do training in the first place. And all of our emphasis has just been more training. And just to say it again, this is not against operant. We all use operant. I could make the argument that no matter how much we care about helping the dog, if we don't also know how things work operantly and are proficient in that tool set of ABA, we ultimately are going to find ourselves cornered where we see what needs to be changed and we have no idea how to do it. So that's a really important element of the work that we do. It's just not all that we do. And if we're not comprehensive in our analysis from that kind of, you know, again, that Tinbergen's model of ultimate and proximate, and we can go all the way back and we can look ultimate, and then we can really look at the entire environment and all those puzzle pieces, then we're going to fail to accurately diagnose, if you will, or understand what's really going on for that dog and what's, you know, underneath that observable surface where we can just see the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and I was just going to chip in with excuse me, the ultimate alignment that has to come, and actually environment itself doesn't matter. What matters ultimately is the caregiver's perception of environment. This is just looking at from the psychology again, because ultimately if the caregiver isn't the one that becomes in alignment with their dog's needs, their perception of what's in the environment will hamper that process, because ultimately the dog is reliant upon the caregiver and how they are introduced to, exposed to, and allowed to process that environment. So when we step back again, we're thinking we've really got to find the best ways to get caregivers to really understand the importance of that alignment with their dog's emotional need. We also have to make them or invite them to recognize the importance of seeking relief for their dog and their role as a caregiver. And it's the same when I was working in human therapy, because you know, this is why, for any trainers and behaviorists listening, and actually I'm writing a blog post on this at the moment, so that might even be out by the time this comes out, but about the fact that we are not responsible for those outcomes as professionals. We have a role to play in seeking best outcomes, but ultimately the caregiver is the one who has to take the final responsibility in allowing those best outcomes to play out. And it's the same when you're working in human therapy. As a therapist, you know, you offer your input, you offer the support, you offer the kind of the outlook for the best outcomes, but you can't be responsible for those. Ultimately, there has to be a certain sense of responsibility from the patient or their caregivers, whoever's there. And this is really important. Traditionally, we've gone in and seen caregivers and we've just opened up an operant toolkit, which is just kind of saying to them, we have to change behavior and this is how we do it, where many of the caregivers might not even understand those mechanics. They've just been told, keep training, keep training. If we start that process by really getting them to recognize that the reason we're having these behaviors is because of some potentially some unmet emotional need from the dog. That's how we get the best alignment, because the environment itself, we can see all these things in the environment, but unless the caregiver is able to and knows about the best ways to present and expose that environment, you're not going to get those best outcomes.
And that's
so I think
the onboarding, right? Because I think some people have spoken about the fact that they struggle with the fact that clients will come to them and say, but I can go to the shock jock down the road and he's promised me within a week that the dog will stop being reactive. So, you know, I'd probably rather do that. But actually, if you're onboarding the clients with the education of, okay, so what is that behavior telling us? You know, what information can we glean? Let's have a think about, you know, other aspects that aren't directly related to that behavior. You know, tell me about what's happening in the rest of your dog's life. Tell me about its interactions at home. Tell me about its diet. Tell me about its history, all of those things. Then it becomes more logical for the person to stay on board with what you're saying, because actually a lot of that makes sense, right? And a lot of it is entirely in parallel to other streams of information that they'll be getting about human psychology and the, you know, children and education shifts and stuff like that. So I think that the trip up, if you like, is almost to think that you're competing with the shock jock down the road, because you're actually not. It's much more about saying, yeah, sure, you can totally do that, and actually I could probably do that for you with some clicker training, you know, within a week or so. But here's why I don't think that that's the best thing for you and your dog right now. I think we need to hear from you what it's like living with your dog. You know, what specifically are you finding challenging about it, and, you know, going into a lot more detail. And then the clients are, you know, just much more onboarded with you in a relationship by the end of the first consult.
And if I could just chip in there, because this is, I'm going to do a little course on this, actually, a little plug, but because I think it's really important, because we don't have enough education for professionals on the psychology and the communication skills that are needed for some of these things. One thing that's really important, we've definitely got to front load very quickly that onboarding. It's quite a new expression, isn't it? Onboarding. I'm hearing it a lot at the moment. I never heard of it maybe 12 months ago, but anyway, onboarding or getting people kind of to really see these things. What we've got to recognize, though, is there's always three types of people when it comes to you know, delivering a message, whether that's politics, whether it's what we're looking at here, or whatever it is you're trying to deliver or sell. And this is to do with belief systems and those belief filters that are there. So you have those whose belief system is already in line, that word alignment again, with what you're trying to say. So they're really easy, right? They're your perfect client, because they're like, yeah, I get it. I just really want to be there. You also, though, on the other end of the spectrum, get those whose belief system is really completely the opposite. And it can be very difficult as professionals, dare I say, even impossible with some people, to kind of counteract that belief system. Then that quite often is not just because they're difficult or wrong people, it's just because their life experiences have dictated that. You know, they've felt shame, they've felt guilt, they've felt all these kind of things. They just really feel that there should be a consequence to behavior because that's how they were brought up, or whatever it is. And then the bulk of the people in the middle, those belief systems aren't set. They're open to us to try and engage with and to persuade to come over. And I think it's important that we understand this as professionals, because we've all had clients, right, where you've really helped them, really worked with them. And then one of my colleagues was saying she's been working with a lady for quite a while now. And then she sent an email saying, we've got a program over here called Dogs Behaving Very Badly, which is not a great show, really, asking if she should put her dog, if she should write into the producer to see if he could come and help with her dog. And that was really demoralizing for her, because she thought, well, I've been working with you for so long. But when we recognize the role of those belief systems and those three types of people, we've got to recognize that you're not always going to persuade somebody not to go to that shock jock up the road, because they might not be ready for that message now. The compliance, the onus on compliance can't fully fit on our shoulders, because that way madness lies for a professional. We can't always be responsible or feel that we're responsible for best outcomes.
Yeah, and I think people feel like they failed in the consult. At the end, the client says, actually, I'm not going to book you know, any more sessions. Whereas sometimes we need to hear the no and just hear, okay, you know, I think as long, I mean, this is what I always feel when I'm consulting, is that as long as I feel like I've done myself justice, as long as I've got the message across about what's on offer, if it's not a good match for you, it's not going to be fun. So actually it's not a good match, and that may change in the future, but right now I hear that, you know, and that's okay.
And the future is important because some people, they're not ready for it now, but they might be down the line. That's the point. But we can only offer what we offer, and people have to find their own truths through that. It's the same in any form of life, really. And those kind of three different types of people, it's pretty well the same. Even when I was going through therapy, you have people who are really ready for it, people who are really not ready for it, and then everybody in the middle who's kind of open to be persuaded. And we've got to take some comfort from those ones who are in alignment with us, because they're our ideal client, right? And we love them, and it's really, really great to have them. We've got to focus our minds on those ones that we have a chance of persuading and bringing over, but try not to be too affected by those that we can't sometimes. But even hearing it in this way, hopefully professionals will think, okay, right, that kind of makes sense. And maybe it isn't about me, and maybe it isn't because I've let the dog down or I failed. It's just because that person's belief system is so strongly different to what I'm trying to offer at this point in time. Then best outcomes are less likely. And I like this term, best outcomes. It's one that I brought over from my human therapy days. We use it a lot in human therapy. The word there is best outcomes. It's not perfect outcome. It's not gold-plated outcome. It's the best outcomes that we can seek based upon what we've got. And I think we need more education on some of this stuff for our fellow professionals, because this is where we all end up. It's a big contributor to emotional health issues in our industry, not being able to think about, or step back a little bit and think about why we have all these frictions and all these difficulties that come along.
That's what I was going to say too, is I was actually just thinking about a thread that I was commenting on Facebook on a professional group about like how many clients most people will see in a day and how they get kind of burnt out if they take more than 3 and stuff like that. And I was thinking about this model that we're all kind of operating in, where we feel like we're competing against the other method and that operant merry-go-round, or else the dog will go to a trainer that does it differently than I do it, and that doesn't fit with my belief system. And so, you know, if we just really get stuck in all of these things that are quite beyond our control. And I've found in so much relief from myself as a professional through increasingly being unapologetic. The more I learned, the more I understood, the more I gave myself permission to operate outside of that operant paradigm. It was like a relief for me and for the clients, shockingly, in most cases. It's almost like you say, look, you're not doing anything wrong and your dog isn't totally messed up. We've just got to get to the bottom of this stuff. You know, we've got to figure it out. And I know it's really frustrating for you. So we validate their experience and their need for help too, their need for relief. And then we say, look, I could do all sorts of things as a trainer. That's a hat I wear, where I could change your dog's behavior. And we can do that. But I don't think that's the best idea, because then we're not going to really get beneath the surface. So things are going to come back, or they're going to pop out over here if we don't get to the bottom of it. So you can use any kind of technique you want to get behavior change, and you can get behavior change really quick. It's not even that hard to get behavior change, right? So we can all do that, but those of us that are really going to be the most successful at reaching those best outcomes, as you say, Andrew, are going to be the ones who can really effectively get to the bottom of things. And one of the secrets that I found that's so effective in that onboarding for clients is most clients don't like dog training. Okay. Those are dog enthusiasts that like dog training. Most clients are like, this is homework. This feels like work. I don't want to do it. It feels like a pain in my butt. You're going to tell me to go home and do these little exercises and stuff. And so if we say, you know what, the truth is, if we get to the heart of these things, then the solutions that we're going to find might even render, you don't even need to do any training. Like the kinds of solutions I want to give you are the things that take things off your plate, not add more to it. And then they hear that and they're like, all right, where do I sign? Right. And so that's the irony, is that even though it feels like we're asking so much more of them in their understanding, we're actually giving them relief too, and taking all of this work to manipulate, modify, and control behavior so perfectly as a dog owner, parent, off of their plate. And so I've found that the onboarding process for clients for me at this point goes really well 99% of the time. I do live in a relatively open-minded, progressive kind of, town in Asheville, North Carolina. And I imagine sometimes what it might be like if I was in a major city, a little bit more kind of anywhere America. But I do think that there are ways to get people on board that don't kind of overwhelm them, but actually can do the opposite.
And listening to them. I mean, I love listening to Bobby talking about consulting skills, because she starts listening to the client before she's ever met them. She'll, look at the way that they got in contact with the practice, like, what their first communication was. She'll listen to all of the information that they've sent, but then she'll have a completely open mind to the fact that that actually may have nothing to do with why they've contacted the service in the first place. So she will go, and when she meets them, she's got all this information. So she could dive in with solution this, solution that, but actually no, she wants to connect with them and really talk to them and get underneath, their kind of presentable reason that they've come, and actually find out, okay, what's really going on here for you? And how are you finding this? And what is this like within your family? And is that causing family tensions? And if so, do we need to prioritize that, etc.? So there's so much listening and connection that goes on with the clients that by the time she gets to the end of the first consult, she may do a little bit of kind of, okay, this is a little bit of planning at the end of the consult, but essentially the main focus has been building that relationship. So you've got some element of trust that actually, I've got your back. I've got your back. I get you. I understand what this is for you. And then I think it really helps the clients also to have that experience, even if they don't identify it, that actually it's not about fixing the dog. It is about that whole family dynamic and lifestyle, and there's much more going on. We all know, like you mentioned Raven earlier, we all know that when we're dealing with challenges with our dogs, there's so many emotional dimensions to that have nothing to do with the behavior. Like a whole range of guilt or tension or whatever it is, and that's all there. So just being open to being a sounding board for that, I think, is also really useful. And that's why it's really interesting kind of listening to you, Andrew, and Kim, in terms of the kind of mediation, relationship building. It's so much more than just about the dog.
Yeah.
And I think especially when we come back to those kind of belief systems again, to try and I agree with you, Kim, I would say, at least 9 out of 10 of my clients that I work with, I'm able to kind of get that front loading and get them invested. But that starts with me learning about them and those belief systems. And the thing is, as soon as you start discussing methodologies and tools straight off the bat, that's more likely to have friction with people's belief systems, because maybe because they've already done it and now they feel you're telling them off, or they're going to feel judged or whatever else. But what I love about starting as a reference, this is why I'm so passionate about talking about the emotional experience, because we all have one and they're all different. So I just need to start thinking about their emotional experience, but even if it's just the emotional experience about having this dog who's a pain in the butt for them, right? And I can talk in those terms, and we can, because then they can have an input, an inlay into their dog's emotional experience. There's always going to be those clients, as I say, who can't get in alignment with how we want to do things, who want that quick fix, who want things done quicker. And guess what? There are plenty of professionals out there who can offer that for them. I think that's what we have to recognize. The clearer you are about your own outlook, the more authentic it is, the more you start to attract people along those lines, or the more people pick up on your passion. I think if you're trying to do this style of working, but don't believe it yourself or believe in it fully yourself, I think that causes problems then, because it has to kind of be cast quite clearly, I think, from the start. This is who I am, this is my outlook, this is how we work, this is how I'm going to really help you to get those best outcomes for your dog.
And we're modeling, right? So if we're going in there with a view that, you know, within the first half an hour, I'm going to convince you that you want to use my methods, that's modeling. I'm going to come in and fix your views or your behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if we go in with, I'm going to listen to you, I'm going to have empathy and compassion for where you are, even if it's because you want to swear your head off because your dog's doing your head in, I've still got empathy and compassion, I'm still here to listen to you, then we're modeling that. We're helping them to mirror and see, you know, have that potential connection with their dog and to start to have empathy with where their dog is. So yeah, I think it's incredibly important. It speaks to the authenticity, doesn't it, of the process?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, I don't know about you guys as you've experienced your own work and circles and people reaching out to you since all this conversation has started, but it's just been amazing to me how many professionals are coming out of the woodwork to say, oh my gosh, like, thank you. This gives me permission to allow myself to think and feel and like facilitate operating more in this direction, because I felt like I couldn't, because it is uncomfortable when we're going against the grain of kind of pop culture dog training, you know, approach and the things that we hear at conferences and how you do your job and all that. And so everything kind of co-validates in that mirroring sense that you're talking about. We're all modeling for each other when we get out here and we're willing to have these conversations in the professional sphere. And then that's also then modeling for clients. I had a funny experience this last week, Matt Beisner with Dog Impossible. He's got his second round of that going on right now. He texted me the other day and he said, Kim, this is so funny. I had a client reach out to me, you know, virtual client, and the first thing out of her mouth when we met for the first time was, I want to go beyond the operant with my dog. And I was
oh, wow.
and it's just some random person that saw it on YouTube, you know, and that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about, is this kind of, if we give ourselves permission to not know everything, and we give ourselves permission to not be, you know, the responsible fixer of the, you know, complaint of the behavior problem, and we're saying, wow, no, our goal is actually to help. Our goal is to get to the bottom of things and create optimal relief for the person and for the dog, best possible outcome. That whole value shift is contagious. It's already contagious. The more we keep talking about it, we're really going to have the hope of creating that shift. And I know what I'm seeing is like another kind of motivational inspiration in the three of us is, I know just through this process, we've all then built up our own kind of offerings to help in that process. So, you know, Andrew, I know you've got dog-centered care, and Kathy, you've got barking brains, and you both have particular kinds of courses that you're developing for that, so that people can fill in some of those blanks in their understanding and do that deeper dive down those rabbit holes, you know, to fill that stuff in, just like I have with my L.E.G.S applied ethology course for professionals. And, you know, we want to continue to kind of expand the conversation together, knowing that none of us have all the answers, but that's kind of the point, right? Is that we're asking as opposed to answering.
Yeah, definitely.
And that bit's really important, because there's people who have been talking about this stuff for a long time, and there's not been the traction, and that would include yourself, Kim, of course. You know, you said yourself, 20 years you've been talking about this, and then you kind of see the tumbleweed going along, and now people are talking about it. I think there is something about this connectivity, about people talking as a united voice now. And I think, you know, when I'm speaking to some colleagues who have been talking about this for a long time, they've been talking on their own, and then they get jumped on, and then they get a lot of flack and a lot of trolling. So it's easier to kind of come off the main grid then, because who wants to have all that thrown at you, right? And all of us know what that feels like. But there's something about this time now where there's multiple voices coming together. We're just sticking to each other like bits of Lego building up, right? And I think that's the most important thing, having a collective voice, asking questions that we don't know the answers to yet necessarily, and also making sure that we do it in a way that, you know, because nobody has ownership of this, right? This is, I think there has been a bit of a trend in our industry in the past that people decided, I'm going to take ownership of that. I'm going to build a brand around that.
Yeah,
that's going to be
brand and sell, brand and sell.
brand and sell. And that's what's so good about these Beyond the Operants, I think, is because, you know, we've got them out and people are listening in, and you know, in my dog center care group, I'm just getting lots of different people to talk about stuff, and some people are well-known people, some people aren't, and that's the point. Some of the best conversations I have are with just I say just, but they're just jobbing professionals doing their thing, and they've learned all this wonderful stuff, but they've been too scared to talk about some of their thoughts on social media because they're going to get jumped on, right?
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the jumping on that I've seen is very much going back to the reason that we started doing Beyond the Operant, because people were really struggling with the idea that there was something other than an operant model, which, you know, Simon Gadbois and I spoke about ages ago, saying, what is going on here? Because as scientists, this makes absolutely no sense. Like, operant conditioning is one paradigm within a whole bunch of paradigms, and yet somehow everything that, you know, it seems like everything that's branded in the dog world is all explained through an operant conditioning lens. And I spend my entire time when Bobby and I are collaborating and kind of putting presentations together with saying things like, okay, so explain what you mean by that method, because, you know, all the methods have got their own names or whatever, and she'll explain it as in, okay, this is what the dog's doing. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't think that's desensitization, or I don't think that's counter conditioning, or I don't think that's operant conditioning. And she's like, well, it has to be, doesn't it? No, that's the point. It doesn't. There's like a whole load of stuff that goes on in the brain that has nothing to do with any of those. It's just that if you think that that's all there is in the world, then every time you try and explain why your method works, you explain it through the operant conditioning. And the reason it's interesting, and the reason I get stuck in these apparent kind of disagreements that I don't think are actually disagreements, is that sure, the methods work, and if you're a good dog trainer, or you're a good dog behaviorist, you will pick those methods for the situations where they're going to work, and you will avoid those methods for the situations where they're not going to work. But that doesn't mean that they're working because they're based on operant conditioning, or because they're based on counter conditioning, or because they're based on desensitization. They just work. And, you know, I have my own views about what's probably going on in the brain that has nothing to do with any of those. And we could discuss that to the nth degree, but as the point you made, Kim, we don't have all the answers necessarily. But I think, you know, because we don't have all the answers, historically, we've tried to kind of squeeze everything into these like tiny little boxes that now just make no sense.
Yeah, and we become experts in behaviorism and that whole stay in your lane kind of argument that's been posed to all of us, right? Like, you don't have masters in all of these different, you know, specialties, so you shouldn't talk about it. But I've kind of come to embrace what I used to feel kind of embarrassed about, which is, okay, so using integrated, you know, behavioral sciences makes us a jack of all trades and a master of none. Okay, like, why is that a bad thing to, like, you know, as long as we don't get arrogant and I start thinking I know everything about neurology, or I know everything about genetics, or I know everything about psychology. None of us do, guys. And we're all out there like pretending like, well, I know everything about applied behavior analysis, so I have all the tools I could ever need. I know all the stuff. Check, check, check. You know what? Even though we all say we're still learning, if you stay completely in that lane because you've prescribed that lane to yourself as a professional, and you're neglecting, even through good intentions of not being arrogant and being outside your lane, all of these other disciplines, we might be missing the answers and the explanations for what we're actually observing. So instead of just picking up a different operant tool, we might say, oh, okay, that the training has nothing to do with it. We need to do this instead. You know, so
the funniest line I ever heard, which I might get put on a t-shirt, is, it doesn't matter how much, this was to me, it doesn't matter how much you tell me about the brain, I'm still gonna use ABA. And I was like, okay, you realize that makes no sense, right?
Right.
And that's not my experience of most, like, I mean, there are a lot of very, very good trainers that either use ABA as part of their toolbox, or trainers that predominantly use ABA. And when you talk to them, they're using that method that's very powerful, and they're using it very effectively. And they're using it in a very similar way to the way that I would use it, and often as part of a toolbox. But then you do get some people, and that's not just ABA, that's like pretty much any method you could, it's like, you know, using aversive tools, for instance, is pretty much the same, where people are just so fixed on, this works, I'm going to keep using it, regardless of what you tell me about physiology in the brain, I'm going to keep using it. I'm like, okay.
Then we're going to continue to have big problems.
Sure we're aligning here.
Right, yeah.
And I think where's the masters on what does it feel like to be a dog? but there isn't one, because when we may never know that. It's going to take many of us. You know, we didn't get to the moon just because somebody was good at maths. There's a lot of stuff that went on that had to come together to do that bigger step. And I think that's what we're talking about, is the coming together of thoughts and asking questions. And for me, it comes back to that notion of the emotional experience. You know, I don't know yours, Kathy, or yours, Kim. I can only really vouch for my own. But I want to learn more about others' emotional experiences. That's how we learn, that's how we grow. And especially the dog. And one discipline won't do that for us.
No.
One discipline could potentially just change behavior, for sure.
Sure.
When we think about learning theory, everybody learns learning theory is the first thing you learn when you're on any kind of course, from a degree down to well, not down to, but, you know, like a diploma or anything else that you do. And that would be great if we were using that as a notion for us to think, right, that gives us a little bit of the jigsaw about how that dog's emotional experience might play out. But sadly, we use learning theory often just because we can learn how best to change a behavior. Because now we know how they kind of learn, we're going to use that to coerce and manipulate so we get the outcome we want. So yes, you can probably...
we don't teach how dogs learn. We teach one small part of learning theory that is based in one moment in historical time, and then somehow translate that to everything else. We don't actually learn learning theory. We just pick out one tiny piece of it and then think that that is learning theory.
And that's the point, really. That's the point I was making, because we use it, and the reason we can stick at that is because it's kind of all we need to know. If we're just going to arbitrarily change behavior, we can do it from that. We can have just one discipline, one thought. And that's probably why it's fitted for such a long time. It's kind of stuck for such a long time, because we haven't thought beyond the operant. Now we are. Now, like I say, Kathy, there's way more things that come in about how we learn, how we process, how we add internal value to things, how we intrinsically make sense of stuff, that difference between structured learning and experimental learning, all these different things that go on.
And I think it's exciting because there are a lot of trainers out there that instinctively know this. And even if they don't spend time thinking about it, even if they haven't been talking about it for ages, they instinctively know that. They instinctively know that they mix up their methods depending on the dog in front of them, and that they're constantly updating their plans depending on what's happening. It's just that there hasn't been a kind of language or conversation around it up until now. And that bit's really exciting, kind of bringing more people into that conversation who've got that experience and have got those views.
Yeah, and a lot of people are coming out who have backgrounds in the other sciences, like behavioral ecology or, you know, evolutionary biology. I had a bioethicist reach out to me. I mean, that are saying, oh, okay, now I can dovetail what I'm thinking about with dog training with this, and you're giving me permission, instead of just having this horrible dissonance. You know, I'm like, oh, okay, right. So we can integrate all these things. And I know here we promised we were going to try to keep it under an hour and a half, and we're at an hour and 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to wrap us up, because we're trying so hard to like,
oh my God, we can
go on for 3 hours. But maybe we can end it with the idea that the spirit of all of this is curiosity. It's questions, not answers. And to invite others to this ongoing table, this conversation that we have started here for the interest of dogs and the people who love them. And I'm going to link to all of our pages. I need to go retroactively do that with the other Beyond the Operant episodes, but I'm going to link back for people in the show notes for the YouTube episode, so they can find all of us individually and the projects you guys are working on as well, in case they want to get involved and deep dive and become, along with us, a jack of all trades-ish, at least be willing to dip our toes in other waters. So thank you both. You guys are so
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, Kathy.
And I hope you guys have a lovely day, and we will circle back around and do this again. I think we've decided our next guest is going to be Mike Shikashio, which is really going to help kind of bring this all back to practical reality for dog trainers too. So look forward to that soon.
Brilliant.
All right. Bye.
Thanks, guys.